Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Jane Messer is a writer of novels, short stories and essays and is a regular contributor to The Conversation. Jane is a former Associate Professor of Creative Writing at Macquarie University and the founder and director of Story Saloon, a live show and podcast dedicated to Australian short stories. Today I'm talking to Jane Messer about her memoir, Rabenmutter: War, Family and Inheritance. Jane, welcome to the Good Reading podcast.
Thank you, Greg. Great to be here.
Jane, let's start with the title of this book, Rabenmutter or Rabenmutter, an old German expression. What is a Rabenmutter?
Well, it turns out that a Rabenmutter, or in English, Rabenmother, is a mother who is regarded as kind of neglectful or abandoning of her children. And it was when I was living in Berlin a few years ago that briefly that I heard the expression. And ironically, because Germany provides lots of free childcare, there is now this sort of use of this old expression again to describe women who actually use childcare and go to work. In the process of writing the book, and then I suddenly thought, oh, okay, this is actually a really good title for my book because it relates to my father's experience of his mother. And so I called it Rabenmutter.
In 2010, your father Michael emailed you a 10-page history of the German side of your family. You write about it as being short but dense with names, addresses and dates, the kind of data I needed to know more about. What did that document reveal and what was missing?
Yeah, it was incredibly useful because for anybody who wants to learn more about their family history, particularly if you've migrated and so going back to old documents gets very complex because they're held in other countries. So it had literally all the names and birth dates of the grandparents and great-grandparents and where they'd lived and some key addresses. And it kind of set out, the names of cousins and so on, which in the normal course of things often kind of get lost in family stories if you don't have people who are good at remembering and good at telling others and that those others in the family, they need to remember all that. So to have it written down is extraordinary and precious. And when I first got the document, I was like, oh, this is great. It says so much. But then I reread it a couple of times and there was a focus on talk about his mother, Bella, and her dying. And then it just sort of abruptly ends. And the more I thought about it, all the stories and the lives, because what these people had lived through was so huge. And some of, my great aunts, for instance, his aunts had died in concentration camps and my great-grandmother and others. And there was just a lot of story there, lives there that weren't addressed. How could they be in 10 pages?
The focus of this book is Bella and her son, Michael, your father. You write that your aim was to make fragments of Bella and my father cohere. But how does one reconstruct a life from fragments without forming a picture of them and their relationships that isn't unbalanced or biased in some way?
Look, I don't think it is possible to do. And what I hope I do in Rabenmutter is show that there is, and I mean, I talk about this quite openly at certain points. What I wanted to find out about Bella and is not going to align with my father's experience of his own mother. I never met her. She had died 21 years before I was born, whereas he did know her a little. But the thing is, neither of us knew her very well because he only lived with her from when he was born to when he was 8, and then again briefly for 2 years from when he was 20 to 22. So mine is through talking to people reading about her life from what I could find, looking really carefully. Luckily, we have hundreds of photographs and many of them are not posed, and trying to place her in history. And often children don't, I mean, why would you? You don't understand your parent as somebody who's lived through history. But she really lived through, I mean, she lived through two world wars, the Holocaust, a series of migrations. She worked with orphan children, refugee children. She did a lot of clandestine work. And my dad didn't really know about that. There were a couple of lines in his late sister's memoir, very short document, that reflect on Bella's work as an advocate for children and the poor. So I mean, I think when you're writing about somebody else, you're trying to be as empathic as you can be to try and put aside your own biases or to alert the reader to your biases. And mine was that I am her granddaughter, and I had grown up being told that my grandmother was a bad woman, a bad mother, an abandoning, neglectful woman who'd never loved my father. And my father is actually a very lovable man. He was he's 99 in a few days. He's a lovely man, and he was a sweet boy. So at a certain point, I just thought, I think my dad is wrong. I can't believe that she just dumped him so that, as he said, she could go to parties and have affairs. And so I'm pleased that I have a different view to my dad about Bella. I think it's necessary.
Let's take a closer look at Bella. Tell me what you know of her life between the wars in Berlin.
At the end of World War One, she was still a youngish, unmarried woman. She'd done work with orphaned and injured children. They'd been through a lot with the Russian invasion in 1914. So she took that experience and the training she'd had, education training she'd had prior to World War One, and then worked back in Berlin in the Schönenberg area as a district welfare officer. And she became more and more experienced. She worked with families in the slums. Well, Germany, as many countries, didn't have welfare systems. They had some, but often they were very inadequate. So a lot of welfare was provided by social organisations and cultural organisations and so on. So she helped families with food, child education, and so on. And then at some point she met my grandfather, Willie. She was about 29 then, got accidentally pregnant and then married. Her first child, Ruth, my aunt, was born, as they say, premature, but wasn't. At that point, she'd given up her job, as was expected of women, and then joined my grandfather in his business, which at that point was a very successful cap and hat manufacturing business. Of course, in those days, all men wore caps or hats all the time, not to bed, but pretty much the rest of the time. And he would travel around Germany. He was a wholesaler, selling to retail shops. She, as was very common, helped with the keeping of the business records and accounts and so on. And they had a really nice life for a short while. But then, as for those of us who know the history of the Third Reich and Hitler and the Weimar Republic, which was very unstable, there was a lot of political conflict as the late 20s and then 1930 with Hitler becoming chancellor, and things just escalated and became worse and worse. For many Germans, but obviously especially for Jewish Germans, all opposition, anybody in opposition to the Third Reich, to the Sinti people, who are the indigenous Romani people of Germany. So they have their own name, Sinti, and all the others whom Hitler and the Third Reich hated and wanted gone.
In 2014, you find yourself in Berlin on something like a history tour. You had Franz Hessel's Walking in Berlin on your mind, along, I guess, with your own imaginings of what life might have been like in your grandparents' city. I guess accompanied by some considerable historical baggage too. It must make for an interesting first encounter with the city and its people when you share such a heritage with it.
Yeah. Look, it's the whole thing. It's just so strange because when I was growing up, Dad, I mean, he'd left Germany when he was 8, and he'd been forced to leave, and he'd never wanted to go back particularly. He did keep his language. He always read in German when he could and would speak German if he could. He was very proud of having of that first language. But I grew up having a very ambivalent feeling about Germany. I had no desire to go to at all. In your bucket list, that was just not on there at all. And then, I mean, obviously, once I started to get interested in Bella, then I had to shift. And there were kind of weird reminders around the house, like on the shelves, we had histories of the Third Reich. In our bathroom, it was a sort of funny story about the weighing scales, because my father was, like many people who've been through war and depression, we're quite focused on weight. But then one time he told me that our weighing scales were made by Krupp's, the manufacturer of. He was actually slightly wrong, but anyway, he thought that there was the manufacturer of the gas chambers. That was actually another company. So it was sort of like there were these really unpleasant reminders of his past. But then when I started to get interested in Bella, then I started to read, and I realized that, that I kind of became more aware of the wall coming down and the kind of reparations. And in fact, because Dad had lost his citizenship, there's a German law which says that people who've had that happen to them, they and their descendants can become nationalized again. So all of us, all Dad's children and the grandchildren, we went through that process of being naturalized as Germans. But when I went to Berlin, I still had a lot of those ambivalent feelings. And then when I arrived with one of my children, who was just about to turn 16, what I found was this incredibly welcoming place that seemed to, of all the places I've been in the world, seemed to be more aware of its dark history and to have more acknowledgement of what it had done to other people, to Jewish people, and to the Sinti, and to homosexuals, and to political opposition. It seemed to be the most advanced place I'd ever been to. And when I would talk to Berliners, whether they were older or younger, they were so interested and so open to hearing my family's history. So they had to do a complete turnabout. But I mean, Berlin is kind of unique in Germany. So I wouldn't say that it's typical of Germany. I felt quite different when I was in Munich, for instance. Not that the people weren't welcoming, but it just felt darker. And it was in a happy time because it was coming up to the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So there was that history, that other history that they were celebrating. And then there was the remarkable good fortune that I had rented an apartment, not knowing through Airbnb, where you don't ever know the exact address when you make the booking. You know the area, but it's not until you've made the booking that the exact address is released. And it turned out that we were living in the apartment next door to the apartment my dad had been born in his street. And my grandparents and other members of their family had lived in that street for decades prior. It felt so fortuitous, and I felt slightly at home in this strange way.
There was plenty of motivation to get out of Europe in those interwar years, and that's exactly what your family planned to do. There's this term aliyah, and that just describes waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine. But what does that term encompass historically and culturally, and for your family in particular?
The word has had many different meanings, and I think it means different things to different people. So making aliyah can be, today it would mean going to your homeland. But it might even be used not necessarily by somebody who thinks of themselves as a Zionist, but that they have a special relationship to the land called Israel. But at the time of my grandparents' immigration there, it was very, very different idea because there was, in the 1930s, Palestine was the British Mandate of Palestine after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. In World War One, which had been I guess you could call the ruler of those lands, which weren't even known as Palestine at that point, Syria and so on. The regional national boundaries were completely different to what we understand now. My grandfather was a little bit of a Zionist insofar as trying to understand it as meaning differently then, was that he was just recognizing that German Jews would never be accepted as German. He thought of himself as a German, but he was constantly finding himself discriminated against. And so he'd said that when he was, as a teenager, he realized, he would never be fully accepted. And then had thought, yeah, there needs to be somewhere that a Jewish person can live and feel at home and safe. So it is, I think, always important to be aware that the way we express something now might not be the way it was experienced, many decades before. The Third Reich was a terrible, terrorizing machine, and law after law after law, particularly between 1933 and 1936, came out, which discriminated against anybody in opposition and Jewish people especially. So anybody Jewish or in opposition lost their jobs in all the educational professions. New curriculums were put into schools for children. There were regulations about who you could marry. There was a lot of economic pressures, increasing taxes. And so, like many German Jews, Bella was applying to immigrate somewhere else. They probably applied to go to America, but they were definitely doing applications to go to Palestine. It all took quite a lot of preparation. So because of the high taxes, it was very hard to, financially. So she would leave regularly with cash sewn into her clothing and take it and to safekeep with friends in other countries. So some of their friends had already migrated to the British Mandate of Palestine. So she went on a couple of trips with money sewed into her clothing. Then she'd come back. Then she took the children, who were Ruth and my father, Michael, in 1935 to England to a school commonly known as Bunce Court. And it had clandestinely left Germany in 1933 and set itself up with about 70 children in Kent, in England. So that in 1935, September 1935, that was the last time my father lived with Bella. When he started at that school, which was a very wonderful and special school. She returned to Berlin. She and my grandfather kept trying to sell the business, but wasn't able to because of the Aryanization laws. But they did get at last a certificate, visa for Palestine. So in 1937, they left Germany and arrived by ship, getting off the boat at Haifa. And just like thousands and thousands of others just trying to start a new life and find their way. We don't really know that much about what my grandfather was trying to do business-wise. Quite soon, I think after, about a year, then had applied for the whole family to come to Australia. But various administrative issues meant that only he could go. She, according to my aunt's records and a couple of letters, Bella was working to basically to illegally to get Jewish children in, because her focus had always been with working with children. She'd been educated in early childhood education. After war broke out, the family were then very, very separated. So in 1939, Dad was a child in England. Bella was alone in Palestine, and my aunt, who was a teenager and like 18, and my grandfather were in Melbourne. So after war broke out, she joined the Palestinian Territorial Auxiliary Service and was stationed in Egypt because, naturally enough, everybody wanted to get Egypt, and they wanted Syria, and they wanted Palestine. And so she was part of the defense force. It was very, arduous work. So she was a colonel all through the war, and I guess trying to lead a normal life and have friends and have some kind of good life, and writing a lot to the children, from what we can tell, though pretty well every letter is lost. And trying to stay connected to her family and friends.
Back to the beginning of the book, you reflect on the journey that you've taken in the writing of this book. You write, leaving the deep past, yet still being present in an unsettled past. Where does it leave you?
Yeah. So I think when I wrote those words, because I was still writing the book, personally, a lot felt unsettled for me. But through the writing of the book and the many, many conversations I've had with my father, which I am so lucky to have had, and he knew, but I audio recorded many of them. So I've been able to listen back. I think I've discovered how much shame I'd had. And this kind of goes to the motivation for writing the book. I'd felt a shame that my father felt he had not been loved, because I was the grandchild of that woman who had not loved him. And I was my father's daughter, and I knew him to be a very lovable person. So there's a shame. Like, how can you be the progeny of somebody who's not liked or loved? You don't want to be that. But I didn't know that. I mean, writing it, I discovered this word shame kind of rose to the surface at some point. So that's part of that personal story. But then there's the unsettled past, and the unsettled present for me now is very much to do with the Jewish and Palestinian people and what is happening today. These two terrible tides of history, as it were, the terrible history of Jews through anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, and then the result of that horrible accident of history, so to speak, the Holocaust, causing the terrible tide of history for Palestinians whose shared homeland, they were dispossessed from and currently, have more or less lost. And it would be wonderful if the book could have been launched into a world where the people were able to live together or adjacent, and that there be two homelands. But that is not what we find ourselves with currently. So I guess I realised through my own pain and through experiencing the trauma of the Holocaust by all the reading that I have done, that then led me to also, through what I very much believe is to have compassion and empathy for others and for other historical events, to discover the trauma that Palestinians then and now experience, and to try and hold these two really difficult, very complex histories together at the same time.
And what's your attitude to the label of Rabenmutter?
What I discovered about my grandmother, which I'm very proud of, was that she always worked really hard. She'd trained in early childhood education. She just worked and worked all through her life to make a better life for herself and her family, but always working for others, always working with people in need wherever they were, whether it be, hundreds of miles away near the border of Russia, or in Berlin, or in the British Mandate of Palestine. And I think the reason I'm sure that the reason she could not live in Melbourne was the circumstances were that she couldn't do anything. There was no point to her life anymore, as she'd always made her life purposeful and wanted to contribute to her community and to society. And then suddenly arriving in Melbourne just wasn't allowed to do that. And she was a woman still in her prime, but getting older, and there was no place for women like her, aged in their 50s in the culture then. And it's really, really sad. I'm proud of her, but I feel a lot of sadness for her. The idea of a Rabenmutter, that a mother cannot be a good mother and a loving mother, but also work, is, quite frankly, ridiculous. And I wouldn't say we should ban that phrase, because we shouldn't ban any phrases, but yeah. But I was trying to encompass the irony, the grim irony, by calling the book Raven Mother, because she certainly wasn't one. And also the other thing is, ornithologically, ravens are very attentive to their chicks.
Jane, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you, Greg. It was really lovely to be able to speak to you.
I've been talking to Jane Messer about her latest book, Raven Mother, War, Family and Inheritance, a Memoir. It's published by New South, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.